Okay, I'm just going to start. You give me a signal if I have to stop earlier than 25 minutes. So first of all, thank you very much for having me. I want to really offer perspective about medical tourism in relation to this. So I'm not a scientist, but I'm finishing a book now on medical tourism with Oxford University Press called Patients with Passports. Another book on the globalization of healthcare, and part of the discussion here is on stem cell therapies. So thinking about stem cell therapies, medical tourism as a form of stem cell tourism, I want to start by just starting at a very high level and offering three different ways of dividing the medical tourism industry. The first is by legal status of the treatment. So there are treatments for services that are legal in the patient's home country and destination country, things like hip replacements, cardiac bypass, cosmetic surgery. Then there's medical tourism for things that are illegal in both the patient's home and destination country. The most notable example is transplant tourism. And finally, there's this middle group of things that are illegal where you come from in the patient's home country, but legal where you're going, what I call circumvention tourism. So examples include abortion, suicide, some forms of reproductive technology usage, and for our purposes, importantly, stem cell tourism. Now, in some of these other examples, it's actually illegal to do the thing that you're doing, but in stem cell tourism instead, it's rather that something has not been approved. Now, maybe that's an important difference, maybe not. I mean, the criminal law affects both, but we'll have a chance to talk about that. So that's one division in the industry. The second division is by the payer type. We have patients paying out of pocket, like the gentleman you just heard from, and that's true too with hip replacements or knee replacements. Then you have, and so a lot of the stuff that's illegal in the patient's home country is this kind. You have uninsured individuals also paying out of pocket. In other parts of the industry, though, you have insurance companies getting in on the game. So you have, for example, insurers, four of the largest insurers in the U.S. offer plans that incentivize private employers to send their patients abroad and split some of the benefit in terms of the cost savings with them, for example. And then outside of the U.S., in places where you have universal health care coverage, such as parts of Europe and Canada, you sometimes have federal payers or state payers paying for individuals to go abroad. We don't see too much of that in the U.S. At the moment. Lastly, I might just sort of discuss the distinction in the industry between patient flow. So this is where patients are coming from and where they're going. And typically we distinguish here north-north flows, so for example from Canada to the U.S. or within the Europe, from south-north, so rich members of the UAE, for example, for a long time came to the Mayo Clinic and the Cleveland Clinic and other parts of the United States. But now we're seeing an increasing amount of north-south travel where individuals are going from the very developed world to the less developed world, and a lot of stem cell tourism actually tracks this kind of flow. Okay. So that's the big picture, but now to try and jump to stem cell tourism to begin with. In general, you see the following motivations for medical tourism. Cost, quality, maybe there's a procedure that's done at a higher level of quality than you can get in your home country. Huge upping in universal health care coverage countries. And finally, circumvention of domestic prohibition. Now, turning to stem cell tourism specifically, what motivates stem cell tourism? Well, as the last gentleman you heard from suggested, it's been estimated from start to finish that the FDA approval process can take up to 10 years for a successful drug. Until a drug is approved, it's illegal to sell the drug to willing patients unless the drug qualifies for one of the FDA's narrow exceptions, in particular the Expanded Access Program. Now, FDA makes some drugs available through this program, but many therapies sought by patients will not meet a number of requirements of the program. Drug sponsors will not pursue marketing approval of the drug for expanded access with due diligence, nor will there have been phase 2 or phase 3 data, nor its equivalent, proving safety or effectiveness of the drug. The approval of the drug sponsor is also required, and that can be difficult, and in some cases making drugs available to patients outside of formal clinical trials will actually interfere with the initiation or conduct of those clinical trials. And medical tourism to countries with more permissive drug approval or access regimes thus proves to be a relatively enticing alternative for patients who want the drug or treatment in question. Now, while the FDA does not regulate surgical interventions, and much of the surgical innovation decisions are left in the hands of individual surgeons and hospitals, there are some legal barriers to patients getting experimental surgeries in the U.S. or other home countries. First, there's a gap in terms of insurance. Insurers in the U.S. typically don't reimburse for experimental or investigational surgeries without clinical effectiveness having been proven. Second, medical malpractice liability may limit surgeons' willingness to provide those therapies, although patients have sometimes had difficulties in establishing negligence in the case of experimental therapies. And finally, if the innovative surgery is considered research, it's going to be governed by the common rule, and thus the IRB system and other regulations of human subjects in the U.S. will essentially put in place an ethical and regulatory review restriction similar to that with clinical trials. Now, because of these forms of regulation, experimental drug and surgical therapies are sometimes unavailable or prohibited in the patient's home country, but available abroad. By traveling abroad, patients like the gentleman you just heard from can engage in a form of regulatory arbitrage to get experimental therapies. And although stem cell therapy and liberation therapy for MS are now the current examples, as a historical matter, one of the most notable examples was U.S. patients traveling to Mexico and elsewhere for Laetrile and other experimental cancer therapies. Indeed, in 1980, Steve McQueen, the American actor, died in a clinic in Rosarito, Mexico, where he was receiving Laetrile. Laetrile was the darling of the 70s, early 80s cancer community of alternative therapies. It later was shown to be ineffective and unsafe. So one of the big questions here is whether the stem cell therapies are the Laetrile of our generation. So let me give you a few examples of the kinds of things we hear from patients in terms of where they're going and why. So China is a major place for this kind of tourism. There are more than 200 hospitals in China. One of the biggest operators is BK Biotechnology. It claims to have treated more than 900 foreign patients in 26 hospitals. Usually charges around $30,000 for a treatment, although there's been at least one case of a family from Detroit paying $85,000 for treatment of their 4-year-old daughter who suffered from spastic quadriplegia. Although they did not get the result they wanted, that she would be able to hold up her head, they credit the treatment with her making her more relaxed and improving her disposition. In Russia, another hotbed for stem cell therapies, there are hundreds of unlicensed clinics, many employing practitioners without medical qualifications, and reports of skin and animal cells being used to replace the fetal cell injection patients were promised. And yet patients who have used these treatments vocally defend the practices on personal blogs and clinic websites. For example, the family of a 16-year-old Norwegian boy with cerebral palsy claims they have seen, quote, remarkable improvements in his language skills and temperament. And moreover, some of the expectations here are being shaped by science hype. The persistent focus in the media and elsewhere on the promise of stem cell technologies, the notion that there is a breakthrough technology just around the corner. So you have, I believe, already heard this morning about Professor Regenberg's 2007 website study, or it was part of the material you were provided. So let me just say a little bit more about patient blogs and patient reactions to these things. So because patient stem cell therapies are typically accessed and paid for outside usual healthcare channels, Ryan, Sanders, Wang, Levine, they looked at alternative data sources, in particular 162 patient blogs written in English over a 3-week period in 2008. They found the blogs through Google searches. Although they say we may have missed a small number that existed, we believe the saturation search strategy identified the vast majority. So although they note that, in fact, the increase that they're seeing may be in part a function of the increase of blogging, they think that, in fact, there's been a major growth, which tracks other things you see. China was by far the largest place for these treatments. 86% of patients were going there, and one particular Chinese company, BK, was providing 71% of the patients studied. They were going for things like spinal cord injury, optic nerve hypoplasia, ataxia, brain injury, multiple sclerosis, ALS, cerebral-optic dysplasia, autism. 2% took their kids there for autism, encephalitis, infantile spasms, Parkinson's disease, and an other category. Treatment regimes varied by clinics. It includes things like umbilical cord, blood stem cells in combination with acupuncture, physical occupational therapy. Stem cells were often injected either intravenously or through cerebrospinal fluid. And in some cases, patients were also given, in addition, autologous bone marrow stem cells. The injections were used for a wide variety of different conditions, a very generic kind of approach. And other clinics claim to be injecting patients with umbilical cord cells, bone marrow stem cell, fetal cells, neural cells from fetal cells, and partially differentiated embryonic stem cells. Treatment length varied from a day or two to a month. The authors noted that the preliminary readings of patient logs revealed that many patients were aware of skepticism of these treatments by physicians in their home country and chose to pursue these unproven treatments despite warnings about potential health risks. And the main reason they gave for dismissing these warnings was that they were being outweighed by testimonies on clinic websites, on patient blogs, and what's heard in conversation. So just to give you a little bit more color here, let me tell you about another study of BK clinics in China with Hayden Chan and Herbert Gottweiss's study. And they basically did interviews with a large number of patients and also looked at Facebook pages, among other things. So let me just tell you a little bit about the things that patients say when you ask them why they're doing this. So here's a quote from an adolescent Canadian girl who had been wheelchair-bound most of her life. She said that she, quote, felt good after the stem cell treatments, which were combined with Chinese acupuncture, unquote. And her mother put this even more strongly. She said, Chinese doctors are better than Canadian doctors. Canadian doctors are greedy. They work for the rich, but the Chinese doctors are happy to help. They're more responsible to their patients and more professional. Our doctors in Canada said Chinese medicine was 30 years ahead of Canada. We think highly of Chinese doctors. We receive very good care, have positive experience here. And it's good to know you've done everything and you've tried everything for your child, even if that means going offshore and trying something experimental. So in general, in these patient testimonies, you see the following three themes. One, suspicion about the motives of home country physicians who don't offer these treatments. Two, the fact that there appeared to be some consultation with home country physicians about using Chinese medicine. And three, the portrayal as more advanced. And a story you hear over and over again is the idea that as a parent, I feel the need to try everything for my child. And although most of these parents don't get exactly what they want from these treatments, they remain hopeful. They're often offered booster therapies and the like. And the idea here is that they think that they're getting some benefit, even if it may be placebo, and they're interested in coming back or trying a booster and the like. So again, I want to kind of be open here to acknowledge the fact that many of these patients are people who feel that they're at their wits' end, especially these parents. They feel an obligation to try everything. They feel that Western medicine has failed them. But I think the big question that you're asking yourselves today, and I've been asking myself in my work, is what should we do about this from a regulatory perspective? So you might think that we should try to prohibit it. It turns out that's fairly difficult to do. It's also the case, I think, that you might think that stem cell therapies are unlikely to fit very well in the current FDA model. In particular, stem cell therapies have none of the stability and predictability of small molecules that make up pills. They're living biological products susceptible to genetic instability. They may behave differently when transplanted into injured sites as opposed to healthy bodies. And as Insoo Hyun has wrote, while some stem cell-based interventions may prove amenable to multi-stage clinical trials approaches, a surgical or transplantation approach may be more appropriate for others. And in those fields, clinical trials are the exceptions rather than the norm because they're so hard to do properly. So one thing I want to leave you with is the idea that perhaps we need to start thinking about this like transplantation and surgery much more so than drugs and small molecules or even biologics. Indeed, the incentive to go offshore, I think, is a major factor from the existing regulatory structure. You heard a little bit from one of the prior speakers about the ISSCR's effort here, but it was shut down because of the threat of defamation. What I would love to see would be FDA, EMA, a consortium of private and non-private actors take up what ISSCR tried to do and generate a quasi-governmental version of it. More specifically, I'd like to see the same kinds of things that ISSCR was looking at, things like IRB review, things like whether you are, in fact, publishing your data and collecting this information, and really provide what I think of as almost like a seal of approval, a sort of accreditation similar to what JCI does for hospitals abroad. And the idea here is we want to drive out the bad apples in favor of the good apples. And the good apples here are people who undergo IRB approval, whose research is based on and whose work is based on prior studies in the literature and who are aware of them, who share data, and who are basically doing this on a limited number of patients first with the hope of engaging more widespread clinical trials within the typical FDA regime, as opposed to smaller entities that are largely for-profit and are basically getting a captive set of populations doing the same things over and over again without sharing their data or making it available. So I think I agree with the gentleman who spoke immediately prior to me in the sense that patients are frustrated and patients need a way to access what they think of as promising. But my hope is that the accreditation and regulation side can push them towards what I think of as good apples, and the U.S. government, instead of saying no, 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 no constantly, can start getting into the job of trying to accredit, trying to encourage maybe insurers, for example, to reimburse some of the experimental when it falls in the parameters of what we think of as research rather than the parameters of what we think of as charlatanism. I don't have too much more time, but the last thing I just want to talk about is something special about this part of the industry, which is the involvement of children. And this is really tragic in that some of these cases, these children are being put at risk. Some of the forms of stem cell therapies that are being used have known cases in causing tumorigenicity and the like, meningitis in one case. And it's a very difficult situation for everybody involved. My own sense, again, is that I saw the warning. I know I have 5 minutes left here to do this, so I'm wrapping up, not to worry. Thank you for the email, though. I will say that my own sense of what the best kind of way forward here is the notion to, again, look into the jurisprudence relating to Laetrile. And in some instances, I think that if you are a home country physician and you have a parent who comes to you and says, I want to take my child abroad to BK or the like, your first job should be to educate them. Your second job, perhaps, if you think that there's a danger to this child, should be to dissuade them. But I think beyond that, you may have an obligation to report them to authorities, because I think in some instances, this can be a form of child abuse. And again, or child neglect, what you're doing here. And again, this is not to impugn the motives of these parents. They are creatures that I have great sympathy towards and understand why you want to try and do everything to your child. But we have some jurisprudence in the area of Laetrile suggesting that in cases where parents wanted to stop things like chemotherapy and put their children on alternative therapies like Laetrile, that if the consensus about the medical establishment in the home country is not only this is going to be ineffective, but actually potentially dangerous, my own view is that it is appropriate for the state to step in parens patriae and to have a role here in trying to regulate. And again, Tim Caulfield and others have written about similar situations in Canadian law. And my sense here is, again, that if you believe what's going on here is potentially dangerous to the child, if there's no evidence that it's safe, if there's no evidence that it's effective, again, if it's ineffective but safe, I think we're in a different category. And it matters whether you're discontinuing existing treatment or what. But to the extent you have reason to believe it may be unsafe, and there is no data available to you suggesting it is safe, I think the state has an obligation to step in and take medical guardianship about some of these children. And that is an element that I think differentiates this kind of medical tourism from other kinds of medical tourism. Okay, let me stop there because I want to make sure there's ample time for questions.
Thanks, Glenn. I think you were on time. So, Michael, do you want to come up here, or do you want to have a microphone at your... No, it's all right. Good.